Entry 32. I've been having a hard time trying to wrap my head around Kaganori's words. It couldn't be, right? I mean, how the hell could the world have come to this? Well, I didn't need to wait much longer for further explanations. Kaganori woke a few hours later. After devouring some forest creature meat, he finally told me and Lauren how the hell he ended up here. As it turns out, he went into hiding in Paradise X after our initial break-in. But since the whole city was kind of a mess to begin with, he was never actually caught. He tried staying hidden on the streets for a few days before he started going delirious from the lack of food in his system. Eventually, somebody stumbled upon him singing to himself in an alleyway. The guy took him into his apartment and fed him some energy bars. "Those things were fucking vile," he told me, "but you gotta eat something." The guy, named Ace, was nice enough to let him stay, but from the way that he described it, the place sounded like absolute hell. While there was running water, it was always scalding for some reason. In addition, AC wasn't really a feasible amenity, so they were sweating buckets in there. But the worst part was the neighbor. Ace explained that he didn't exactly know what was in the room next to them, but that they weren't supposed to risk letting it out. That meant at night, they were forced to listen to something stomp around next to them while letting out a ghoulish wail. And for whatever reason, it only moved around at night. Eventually, Kaganori started working at a food production factory in order to help with the rent. It was the same one Ace was employed at. It was easy for him to land the job because the staff turnover was staggeringly high. I almost gagged when he told me what those bars were actually made out of. Anyways, a few weeks passed, but he finds himself walking alone home at night. Even though the place was lawless, crime surprisingly wasn't a huge problem. However, I guess it made sense. Everybody in that place was essentially a walking shell, just a ghost wandering around in hell. Nobody would really bother trying to rob anybody else, it just wasn't worth it. As he's about halfway back to the apartment, he spots somebody up ahead. In any other instance, he wouldn't have cared, but this person seemed familiar. It was Rust. He caught up to him and they started talking. They were both about as equally surprised to see each other. When he asked Rust how he got in here, his demeanor soured. Apparently, the settlement that we'd first stumbled upon years ago was decimated by Paradise X soldiers. The reason was unclear, but it probably had something to do with our break-in. He said that he'd seen innocent children get slaughtered in front of his very eyes. This wasn't pleasant for me to hear, of course. I felt like I already had too much blood on my hands. Fucking hell. Anyways, as it was about to be his turn, he tried reasoning his way out of death. He claimed that he had skills that could be useful to them, and this was true, of course. The guy had 3 engineering degrees. After an extensive period of pleading, they decided to give him a chance. There was a helicopter that needed work, and nobody over there had the technical skill to do it. If he could fix it within a month, then he'd be spared. If not, well, you get the picture. It took him 29 days, but he finally did it. After that, he was essentially employed as a mechanical engineer. However, he wasn't planning on staying. He told Kaganori that he had something big in mind. What that was exactly, Kaganori would just have to find out. Rust instructed him to survive for 2 more weeks before meeting him at his place. That was all that he told me, Kaganori stated. I just trusted him. There was nothing else I could do, you know? He waited, just trudging along for the next couple of weeks before knocking on Rust's door. He didn't say much when he opened up, just told Kaganori to follow him, that the plan was already in action. He led him to the factory where he'd apparently been working at. The soldiers guarding it asked Rust who the hell Kaganori was. In response, he pulled out a nail gun and shot both of them in the head. And since all that they had were batons, they couldn't do anything about it. Reeling in shock, Kaganori asked him what the hell he was doing. Rust just told him not to worry, that this was the only way out. They walked into the place and started heading towards the back. Once there, Rust swung open a metal door and they found themselves in a tight maze of corridors. This is when Rust told him to run. They maneuvered around the claustrophobic space, taking out more guards that were scattered throughout. After a while, they started hearing distant yelling and footsteps behind them. Kaganori yelled at Rust to let him know what the hell was going on, but he was just told to be patient. He soon realized why. About 20 seconds later, a thundering explosion could be heard from outside. As Rust would tell him later, he'd been spending his free time working on crude explosives with materials he'd stolen from the factory. He'd been discreetly setting them up near the barrier walls, day by day, until it seemed enough to create a considerable entrance hole. A hole big enough for the creatures to get in. Eventually, they found themselves in a control room with a ladder leading upwards. There were 2 more guards in there, which Rust also took out. It was perfect because after that, he'd run out of ammo. They hurried up the ladders, sealing the entryway with scrap metal as they climbed onto a rooftop. There was a helicopter sitting there, about 10 meters away. This was the one that Rust had been commissioned to fix. You see, he'd been planning ahead for a while. Even though he'd essentially fully fixed it within the first few days he was there, he pretended like he didn't. He did this in order to have more time to tamper with the controls, as well as asking around and trying to get a sense of what each button and lever did. In the back of his mind, he knew that flying away was the only way off the island. Eventually, on the 29th day, he'd figured it out completely. That's when he started planting the bombs. The thing is, even though he'd fixed the engine, it still took an exorbitant amount of time to power up, about an hour and change. That's why he needed a distraction. If he could just sit in the aircraft waiting, the guards would have easily gotten to the rooftop in time and smoked him. But thanks to the explosion, now they were forced to deal with the horrors outside the walls. As Rust started up the helicopter, Kaganori looked down at the chaos that had plagued the city. Monstrous abominations were rampaging the place and killing everything in sight. The guards tried quelling the ungodly assault, but to no avail. At one point, a large crocodile-looking thing started climbing up the walls to the roof towards them. It took Kaganori about 22 swings with a baton before it eventually decided to crawl back down. About an hour passes before they start to hear banging coming from the rooftop entrance. It sounded like somebody was using a battering ram. Unfortunately, the helicopter had taken off before they had to deal with it. As they ascended into the murky sky, Kaganori looked down at the scene below. As it turns out, Rust underestimated how strong his explosives were. A huge chunk of the wall and the surrounding areas had been destroyed. There wasn't even much movement on the ground anymore. Everybody was either dead or in hiding. That's when it dawned on him. Rust had just inadvertently killed a lot of people, a lot of innocents, in fact. He was about to say something when Rust seemed to read his mind and stopped him. Those were people down there. They didn't have lives worth living. I just put them out of their misery. Kaganori didn't try to argue with him. Deep down, he agreed with him. He just didn't want to admit it. They flew around for a few hours before he finally asked Rust where they were going. In response, he just sighed and said that he didn't know, but that anywhere would be better than Dusk Blue. Eventually, they spotted an island and decided to descend. The engine needed to cool down anyway, so Rust thought that this was a better time than never. The island itself was insane. Just off of the flat shore stood mountains that apparently put Everest to shame. The whole place was full of them. At the base of the monumental ounce were what appeared to be vast, open cave systems. They explored the place cautiously, not wanting to draw any attention to themselves. However, it seemed that there was nothing on the island at all, just them. Russ told Kaganori to stay back and watch the helicopter while he explored the caves. While he initially objected to this, he figured that it'd be safer on the shore than in the darkness of the caverns. Russ put together a makeshift torch with some scrap wood and disappeared into the entrance. Kaganori said that he waited there for what felt like hours. He was starting to get worried, but eventually Russ finally surfaced from the dark. He seemed unharmed, but his expression told a different story. He looked horrified. He was also holding a small book. Kaganori asked him what had happened before Russ just handed it over. It was old and the cover was peeling off, but there was no denying what it was. A Bible. Kaganori had been Protestant for the longest time, so he'd essentially memorized the first few pages by heart. He read it over and over, and it lined up perfectly. Rust explained that he found it sitting in the middle of a crudely drawn symbol, like it was part of some kind of botched ritual or something. They just sat there for a while after that. None of them had any words to say. This was a troubling revelation after all. Rust broke the silence a little while later. That wasn't it. Apparently, he'd also seen some cave paintings in there, along with pieces of what looked like torn manuscripts. He pulled them out of his bag, but they were all in Latin. Fortunately, Rust knew the language. From what he'd pieced together, something happened in 2026 that sent the world spiraling into what we were in now. It was unclear what this event exactly was, however. The writings were all vague, with words like corrupted and reborn popping up a lot. However, that wasn't even the most interesting part. The year 2014 also seemed to be significant. Russ' conjecture was that somebody had done something back then that took 12 years to fully manifest. Again, what really happened remained a mystery. All he had was the dates. There was one last significant thing that he saw in there. A painting of a map on one of the cave walls. It seemed to be an outline of the New World. Apparently, the only thing that Russ could somewhat recognize was North America and East Asia. The other continents were torn into pieces. However, there was one small island that seemed to be worth noting. It looked to be on the equator line, around where South America should have been. There was an arrow pointing to it, connected to a single word. Liberatio, Latin for deliverance. "That's where we're headed," Rust exclaimed. "Maybe we'll find answers." Kaganori asked him how the hell they were going to get there. "I'll figure out a way," was Rust's only response. Right after he said that, the ground beneath them started rumbling. They soon figured out why there was nothing else on the island. They looked over at the mountains behind them. They were shaken, but it didn't seem to look like an earthquake. There was a pattern to it, almost as if they were being caused by footsteps. Eventually, they saw something moving in the distance, something colossal. They didn't waste any more time, hopping into the helicopter and getting the hell out of there. As they left the island behind, Kaganori watched as a creature around double the size of the mountains made its way onto the shore. Since it was obscured by some kind of mist, he couldn't quite make out the details, but it was a humanoid for sure. What disturbed him the most was the bellowing laugh that it let out afterwards. The voice was deep and guttural, sending ripples through the sea below. It was also sinister in tone, like it knew what they had just discovered. After that, they flew around for a few more hours before Rust admitted that there was a problem. He didn't know how to get to the island depicted on the cave painting. He suggested that they scavenge another island in order to find materials for a compass. However, there didn't seem to be one in sight. They weren't low on fuel just yet, but that could change quickly. The situation got even worse when they flew into a brutal storm. And Kaganori claimed that it happened so suddenly. One second the sky were dry, the next they were filled with heavy winds, rain, and lightning. It was inexplicable, but then again, in this world, that seemed to be the norm. It got so bad that Russ told him to put one of the parachutes on, just in case. There were no doors on the aircraft after all, and as it turns out, that was a good call. A strong burst of wind tilted the helicopter to the side. Kaganori's fingers slipped from a railing he was holding on to and fell out. As he made his harsh descent, he tried to gauge what he was heading into. However, the rain had gotten so bad that he could barely open his eyes. He made a swift judgment, waiting 10 seconds before ultimately opening the parachute. As he felt himself floating downwards, he started to feel the rain subside. He opened his eyes, being both surprised and relieved to find land waiting for him below. There seemed to be people on it as well, but as he got closer, he came out to a horrifying realization. Those weren't people, or at least, not anymore. He'd made it to Dead Man's Land. After landing, he freaked out and started running away from the horde of zombies that had now focused their collective attentions on him. Eventually, he'd come across the settlement that we were in now. He'd been here ever since, going on regular hunting trips and establishing himself as part of the community. But about a year ago, he'd been captured by the psychos we encountered yesterday. As it turns out, they were batshit crazy. They took turns torturing and toying around with him, as well as the others that he was with for pure entertainment. At one point, they were driving out, planning on tying him to a tree and letting the zombies swarm him. Unfortunately, that was also when we crossed paths with him and saved him. He seemed to be getting lightheaded as he finished telling me this. The nurse told me that he needed more rest, so I let him be. However, he let me know one more thing before slipping out of consciousness again. I don't know if Rust is still alive. I don't know where he is. I don't know. I'm sitting here now, pondering the implications of Rust's discovery. If this really is the future, then what the hell happened in 2026? How could that have led to this? What was on that island Russ was trying to get to? Were we ever getting out of here? But like Kaganori, I guess I just don't know. Entry 33. I woke up this morning to heavy commotion. Everybody seemed scared of something. I asked around, eventually finding out that some kind of machine had been shot down over the island just a few minutes ago. I walked over to where they were keeping it. The smoker was already there, holding it in his hands. It was small and compact, looking extremely futuristic, which made sense now. I asked him what the hell it was, and he stared at me, eyes wide. Neo-Civicus, he uttered out. This is a scout drone. They always send these before they're about to invade. Confused and shocked, I took a closer look at it. In big bold letters was the phrase, NC Military, written right on top of it. Fucking hell. Not sure what's gonna happen next, but based off of everything that's happened so far, it's gonna be one hell of a time, for better or for worse. Entry 34. It's been really quiet around here after the drone incident. Everybody seemed a bit confused at first. Although Smoker tried explaining the nature of Neo-Civicus to them, they didn't seem to want to believe him. It only took a few other people with knowledge of the place to finally convince everybody that this was not good news. The Smoker also went on to explain that the drones meant they could be coming in weeks or years. In other words, we could never anticipate their arrival. I asked him why they'd even be interested in this place at all. Resources, colonization, most likely the resources though. He seemed incredibly worried as he told me this, but I couldn't understand why. I mean, if the only thing that they were after were some resources, then we'd just let them take it, right? No problems there. No, he said sternly. They don't work like that. You see, nobody likes giving up their shit to an invading force, right? But nobody would ever even bother fighting back if they knew what kind of power Neo-Civicus has. Problem is, most people just don't. That's why they always retaliate at first. The battle never lasts very long. He sighed, pausing for a bit before continuing. Here's the thing with Neo-Civicus. There's never any paperwork with them. No deals, no negotiations, nothing. Wherever they go, they eliminate the native population, no questions asked. It's just simpler that way. Besides, most islands that they land on are incredibly hostile anyways. There's no risk to be taken with them. However, even as everybody started to prepare for the oncoming assault, the Smoker just scoffed at them. There ain't no point. Once they land, we're all dead. It's hopeless. So, what are you gonna do? Just give up and let them kill you? I asked him. He furrowed his brow. Nah, I'll be long gone before they arrive. There's a lot more dignified ways to die. But fighting a pointless battle, that just ain't one of them. I'll have a better chance out there as opposed to staying here. Carrying nothing but a small sack of rations, one rifle, and a few knives, he just left a few days later. He didn't tell us where he was going, but I'm pretty sure that he wasn't sure himself. Before his departure, he asked me if I wanted to join him. Despite the grim reality that seemed to be waiting for me, I declined his offer. I suppose that there was just a small part of me that thought he was bullshitting about this whole thing. But in retrospect, that didn't make any sense. I guess I just didn't want to deal with the horrors out there on this island. I guess I'm just taking my chances. But Coons did eventually recover yesterday, so I guess that's good news. Entry 35. A few more months have passed. At this point, we've prepared to the best of our abilities. However, Smoker's words still linger for me. There ain't no point. What if he's right? Hell, why would he be lying? He left for Christ's sake. What's worse is that nobody really explained it to Jolanne yet. She's confused as to why everybody's so tense these days. She knows that we might have to fight some people sooner or later, but she has no idea what the scale of it just might be. I should break the news to her, but I don't really want to. Entry 36. A few more months have passed, but we finally come up with something. Smoker said that they're most likely coming for resources, right? Well, this place is filled to the brim with zombies and other shit. That'll pose a nuisance for sure. Not the ideal area to harvest or mine. You see, the creatures here are mostly attracted to sound. The more we make, the more congested the ground below us seems to be. So here's the plan. We've stockpiled plenty of food already, enough to last us months. We'll start creating a lot of noise and draw a massive crowd of them over. The idea here is that once Neo-Civicus sees this, they'll deem the effort to not be worth it and just leave us alone. It might work. I mean, actually, I have no idea, but it's worth a shot at least. Entry 37. It's gonna happen soon. A few hours ago, about 3 more drones flew over. 2 of them seemed to be mapping out the forests and surrounding areas, while the third hovered around where we were. We didn't bother shooting it down this time. We wanted it to see the hordes of undead piled at the base of our towers. We wanted to convince them to call everything off right there. They left about 5 minutes after they came, so that's probably good news. Now, we just wait and see. Entry 38. I don't know how long it's been since that last entry. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't even know where I am. Fuck. It was about a week maybe since we'd sighted those 3 drones when they finally came. Now, I don't know what I was expecting. What the hell anybody was expecting for that matter. We were prepared to come face to face with the fucking cavalry. An army, if you will. But no, it was a single damn aircraft. I could barely comprehend what it even looked like. It was futuristic, but not in the traditional sense of the word. It was alien. Otherworldly. Not big, but beyond functional. It nearly resembled some kind of pod and moved with such smoothness that you'd think that it was being controlled remotely. As the shiny vehicle descended onto the shore about a quarter mile away from us, it started getting swarmed. It just sat there for maybe about 5 minutes. At that point, it had become buried underneath a pile of undead flesh. We were optimistic for a second. We couldn't fathom how they were getting out of that. But then we witnessed the solution. The sound was sharp at first, gradually devolving into a low hum. The pod emitted a light so bright that we all had to avert our eyes for a few moments. When we returned our perception to the shore, we all went into a collective shock. The zombies had been cleared out, but that's an understatement. They were eviscerated. No limbs, no bones, nothing. Just a red mist lingering in the air around it. We didn't even know how to react. The undead that had been surrounding our tower started trudging their way over to the shore, attracted by the noise. The doors to the space-age machine opened up. Out stepped 3 figures, just 3, and that was it. They looked to be wearing some kind of armor, but they weren't the massive, clunky kind that the guards at the prison had. Like the ship that they came in, it was advanced beyond our comprehension. They were sleek, black suits that seemed to bend and twist perfectly with every subtle movement they made. Their helmets resembled futuristic gas masks, with 2 large circular eye holes that glowed with a menacing shade of red. The rifles they were carrying looked compact and deadly. They were also a very strange color, a dark, bluish green that seemed to reflect every source of light that bounced off of it. They walked for about 5 seconds before ascending into the air. It looked so seamless. Their boots didn't even seem to have any thrusters, so it was unclear as to how this was possible. As they floated towards us, they dropped tiny blue orbs onto the ground below. As soon as they landed, every zombie within our perceivable vicinity appeared to start being electrocuted, albeit not for long. They dropped in seconds. As the stench of burning, rotten flesh filled the air, the super soldiers descended onto our towers. One landed just a few feet away from me. I saw what I assumed to be his name and position etched onto the barrel of his weapon. Captain Rizzer. I caught a glimpse of his suit up close. It was more intricate than I initially thought. It looked more like an exoskeleton than anything. It was outfitted with pistols and tasers, amongst other things. There was writing on its chest. In big white letters it read, Neo-Civicus, Recon Division 34. He was also larger than any human I'd ever seen before. Larger than the warden, even. He must have been around 9 feet tall. They didn't move at first, seemingly just observing us. At this point, I was holding on to Jolanne tight. I also exchanged glances with Coons, Lauren, and Kaganori. It was almost a silent acknowledgement. We'd been through so much together. If these were our last moments alive, we wanted to make sure that we recognized this. I wasn't even prepared for what happened next. Before I even had time to react, I looked in front of me to see the barrel of Rizzer's weapon aimed directly at me. Or so I thought it was. I closed my eyes, bracing for bullets that were surely about to penetrate my skin. I heard the harsh automatic buzz of the rifle, but I felt no pain. Instead, I only heard screaming from all around me and warm liquid soaking into the side of my shirt. I knew what it was. I looked down at Jolanne's limp body. Apparently, the rounds were so strong that they had cut her in half. Without being given even a second of time to grieve, I felt a sharp, numbing sensation in my thigh. It eventually made its way up to my hips and into my shoulder. I fell to the floor, hitting my head hard as I did. While I could still feel everything above my neck, everything below that seemed to be out of commission. I couldn't even turn away from the horrific sights in front of me. They were killing en masse, women, the elderly, even children, without remorse. A few minutes later, they picked up the ones they deemed fit enough to survive and tossed us onto a single tower. Everybody else seemed to be affected by the paralyzing agent as well. I could see Coons and Kaganori out of the corners of my eyes, but no Lauren. We watched as the 3 soldiers walked around on the ground, planting what looked like small charges into the dirt. By this time, more zombies had wandered their way into the settlement area, but the soldiers didn't even seem to acknowledge them. The creatures would bite and scratch against their armor, but it would do less than nothing. Eventually, the soldiers stepped back and one of them projected a hologram out of his wrist. I couldn't tell what he was looking at, but I had an idea. He pressed some virtual buttons before holding up 5 fingers. Once they were all down, a mind-jolting explosion echoed through the air. Bits of dirt and zombie entrails flew everywhere, pelting us in the face. When the smoke cleared, we looked back down to see an enormous black pit of what was once solid ground. However, as I looked at it even closer, I realized that it wasn't empty. It was bubbling. It was liquid. The first thought that popped into my head was oil. That was as good a guess as any, after all. And soon after, one of the soldiers flew back up to the tower we were involuntarily sitting in. It was Rizzer again. He took out a large, syringe-looking device filled with dark red liquid. "Don't squirm, this'll hurt a lot." He injected it into a few guys sitting around me before I finally felt the needle plunge into my forearm. What followed was an intense burning sensation that seemed to last forever. However, I seemed to be gaining the feeling back into my limbs as well. A few of us tried escaping, but were shot down without hesitation. The rest of us just sat tight. After he had finished up with everybody, he addressed us directly. "You have 2 options here. Die or do manual labor. It seems pretty obvious to me. You guys might be pissed right now, but let me tell you that I do not give a fuck. These things happen." As it turns out, we were forced to pump the dark liquid through tubes connected to this elaborate-looking machine, and then transfer them into metal barrels and then finally load them onto a larger aircraft that would come around once a week. However, the liquid itself was a lot less viscous than oil. It also seemed to be bubbling indefinitely. Safe to say, I had no idea what it was, and I still don't. The only good thing that came out of this was that the soldiers had set up a moderate-sized electric barrier around our settlement, as to stop any additional creatures from interfering with our work. However, we also weren't getting out. They also provided us with food. Unsurprisingly, they were just more energy bars. But these at least tasted decent. Other than that, though, it was absolute hell. It was prison all over again. By the time the first month had expired, almost half of us had taken our own lives. In an apparent attempt to combat this, one of the soldiers announced that once we'd finished up, we would be given a place to stay in Neo-Civicus. Most of us seemed to buy it, because worker morale skyrocketed right after he'd said that. However, I didn't. I'd always been good at reading people, and they were full of shit. They weren't planning on taking us back with them. They were gonna waste us as soon as they got enough of that damn liquid. That was the only outcome that could have been waiting for us. I don't know why I didn't just end it myself. Blind hope, I suppose. But it was also something else. By all odds, I should have been dead at this point. Everybody around me seemed to be biting the dust, but I was still alive somehow. I shouldn't have been. I still shouldn't be. Something must have been working in my favor. Whether it was some kind of divine intervention or just dumb luck was irrelevant. It was doing the job for me. This train of thought kept me going. Somehow, I was getting out of this alive. Turns out, I was right. I don't know how much time had gone by when it happened. It must have been months at the very least. Or a year, I don't really know. One day, we were working away when we started to feel the ground rumbling beneath our feet. We looked at the crater of liquid. At that point, we depleted a considerable amount of it. It must have been at least a few meters lower than when we started. The rumbling only got more severe. The soldiers themselves didn't seem to know what was going on, but eventually it got to the point where we could barely stand up. The soldiers lifted into the sky, trying to make sense of all of it. The ground finally settled a few minutes later. All was still again. Without knowing what else to do, they just instructed us to go back to pumping. However, as soon as we flipped on the machine again, the ground beneath us started cracking. We all stepped back away on instinct. Suddenly, an enormous black creature burst out of the ground. I stumbled back, but got a better look at it in the process. It was a massive, worm-like thing with slimy black flesh and sharp appendages sticking out at various angles. It burst into the air, lunging up at one of the surprised soldiers. At that point, all hell broke loose. The worm was followed by another, and then another. During the chaos, I remembered something. I had hidden the last few shards from the prison in a hidden compartment on one of the towers. I rushed up there to look for it. I found it just as soon as the tower started collapsing. I cut myself mere moments before hitting the ground again. I looked up, witnessing the surreal scene in front of me. My fellow prisoners were mostly dead, being swallowed up by the worms at a torrid pace. I saw coons trying to hop over the now broken electrical barrier before being cut open by one of their appendages. The 3 soldiers were throwing everything they had at the creatures, shooting them down one by one, but they just kept coming up. As I was taking all of this in, something hit me from behind and flung me into a tree. As I lifted myself back up, I saw one of the soldiers being overwhelmed. The 2 others seemed to shout something to each other before one of them took a rectangular device off of his belt. He pressed one of the buttons on it before tossing it down to the ground. As soon as he did this, they flew out of there, leaving their fellow soldier behind. At first, I thought the device was going to be an explosive of sorts, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I watched as it opened up and a dark purple light began emanating out of it. It started growing and growing, engulfing the surrounding area. I started running when I realized that it wasn't stopping. However, as I got back up, I felt myself being tugged backwards. I turned around, expecting to see one of the soldiers, but there was nothing there. Just the purple void getting ever so bigger. I fell to the ground, clawing at the soil as I was sucked into an unknown fate. As the light consumed me, I felt weightless for a second, but I couldn't breathe. I looked around, only to see dark, vague shapes floating around me in a sea of purple nothingness. After about 20 seconds, I blacked out. I awoke an unknown amount of time later, face down in what I assumed to be sand. I groggily got up and looked around, but I could barely see in front of me. I was surrounded by what appeared to be a heavy orange fog. It was pretty evident that I was in some sort of desert, but every other detail was obscured. I only realized that my hearing was gone when it started to come back. That's when I heard the sounds of distant screams all around me. And suddenly, I could make out a shape in the distance. It was hard to tell what it was, but it seemed to be getting closer to me. Getting too close. It was one of those worms that had burst out of the ground. I jumped out of the way just in time to avoid it as it lunged towards me. I scrambled backwards as it buried into the sand. It slithered around, trying to regain its bearings before it seemed to locate me. As it tried to lunge at me again, it looked as if it was being held back by something. It tried a few more times before a heavy, guttural roar emanated from somewhere just behind it. Suddenly, the worm was dragged backwards and out of my sight. I didn't catch a glimpse of what did it. I got up and started running away, but I really had no idea where I was going. Hell, I didn't know where the hell this place even was. About every step I'd take, I'd hear these ungodly sounds coming up from every angle around me. Every time I'd see a moving shape in the distance, I'd change directions. It took a while, but I finally stumbled upon a ramshackle cabin. It was the first indication that humans must exist somewhere in this place. It was old and rotting, but I was tired as hell, so I decided to go in and take refuge for a while. And to my surprise, there was a bed in there, along with a pail of water in the corner. Although it was warm from the boiling temperature outside, it tasted like heaven to me. That's where I am right now. After writing this down, I'm gonna need to pass out. I'm so tired, I don't know how the hell I got here. Maybe that device the soldiers threw down was a teleportation mechanism of sorts? Hell. Then where did it take me to?